His name was Ferdinand Magellan. Born in Portugal, raised among courtiers, he should have lived and died in service to his homeland. Yet when his own country turned its back on him, he did not surrender. Instead, he carried a daring idea to the Spanish king. What if the riches of the East could be reached not by sailing east, but by venturing west into the unknown? Why would a Portuguese nobleman abandon his king and pledge loyalty to Spain, their greatest rival? How did he convince a young monarch to send him toward waters no European had ever crossed? Why did mutiny erupt at the very dawn of his journey? Where did he discover the hidden strait that would forever alter the world's maps? And why did Magellan himself never live to see the glory of his triumph? This is the story of the world's first circumnavigation, a voyage that began in doubt, was sustained by hardship, and ended in legend. It is a tale of ships broken on reefs, of men wandering for months across a silent Pacific, and of one battered vessel returning alone, completing the impossible. Suggest in the comments topics for new stories, and subscribe to the channel. New bedtime stories come out here every day, and now let us step back to the beginning. Ferdinand Magellan was born in the year 1480, in the northern hills of Portugal, in the quiet village of Sabrosa. Vineyards stretched across the slopes, olive groves swayed in the dry wind, and narrow stone roads led from one hamlet to the next. His family belonged to the minor nobility, noble enough to carry honour, but not wealthy enough to grant their children an easy life. His father, Rodrigo Magellan, served as a royal administrator responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining law in the district. His mother, Alda de Mesquita, came from a respected local family, and through her lineage Magellan was given access to a decent education. In the Magellan household, learning was treated with reverence. The boy studied letters and numbers, learned to read scripture and write his first words, listened to the parish priest and memorized Latin prayers and catechism. Yet his childhood was not bound only to books and candlelight. He followed his father in matters of duty, helped with ledgers and errands, and joined hunts through the wooded hills. He listened to travellers, traders, mercenaries, sailors, who passed through the village carrying rumours of distant lands. They spoke of kingdoms drenched in spice and gold, of peoples with different gods, different skins, and languages like music. Those stories burned in the boy's imagination, planting a hunger that would never fade, the hunger for faraway journeys. The boy of Sabrosa was already gazing beyond the horizon. Destiny carried him further than he could imagine. At the age of 12, Ferdinand was sent away from the vineyards and stone roads of his childhood. His family entrusted him to the royal court of Queen Leonor, widow of King Juan II, who still resided under the new monarch Manuel I. In Lisbon, the boy became a page. It was more than service. It was a test of his spirit. He left behind the simplicity of village life and stepped into the palace corridors, where silken robes rustled, golden goblets glimmered, and the air itself seemed perfumed with power. Among courtiers, he learned their strict etiquette, their refined manners, their endless debates of politics and distant voyages. Here, the education of the young Magellan deepened. He was taught fencing and horsemanship, the arts of geography, astronomy, navigation, and cartography, the sciences that gave Portugal its edge in the age of discovery. Lisbon itself was alive with the sea. The harbour trembled with sails, with shouts of sailors and the groan of timbers. Markets overflowed with cinnamon and pepper, silks and porcelain. The royal court buzzed with dreams of overseas empires. Bartolomeu Dias had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Vasco da Gama had reached India. King Manuel now dreamed of Portugal ruling the Indian Ocean. Magellan was not born into great nobility, yet his mind absorbed everything. Contemporary accounts spoke of his patience, his tireless attention to detail. He studied not as one fulfilling duty, but as one already possessed by the idea of oceans. By 25, his path was no longer theoretical. He entered military and naval service. He was placed under the command of Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India. The fleet was prepared with great care, not merely to protect trade, but to establish permanent power in the east. The voyage was long. Ships crossed the Atlantic, skirted Africa, slipped past Mozambique and Zanzibar, until at last they anchored on the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. There, Magellan's first true trials began. He fought in skirmishes against Moorish vessels. He guarded merchant caravans along the Malabar coast. He protected trading posts in Cananor and Cochin, carried out garrison duties, and year by year came to understand a harsh truth. In these lands, power did not belong to kings on thrones, nor to merchants with coin. It belonged to those who mastered the fleets. In 1510, he returned once more to India, this time under Afonso de Albuquerque, restless, fierce, merciless, who captured Goa and transformed it into the capital of Portuguese India. For Magellan, one campaign would leave a mark deeper than all the rest. The struggle for Malacca. The city was no ordinary prize. It was the throat of Asia, a crossroads of trade between China, Java and India. Whoever held Malacca commanded the flow of the world's spices, and so began a battle that would change the course of his own body and his destiny. The assault on Malacca was brutal. Portuguese troops advanced into a maze of barricaded streets, where every corner became a battlefield and every house a fortress. Stones rained from rooftops, arrows cut through the smoky air, and the clash of steel echoed between wooden shutters. In the chaos, Magellan fought side by side with his men. Somewhere amid the shouting and the press of bodies, a spear found his leg. The wound was deep. Chroniclers would later insist it troubled him for the rest of his life, leaving a limp that became part of his silhouette. Yet even as blood seeped into the dirt, he did not falter. Witnesses swore he remained calm, issuing orders with a steady voice, striking when he had to, and refusing to let panic seep into his men. When the fighting ended, the city had fallen. For his part in the campaign, Magellan was rewarded with slaves, a portion of the spoils, and formal thanks from his commanders. But promotion never came. Titles, ranks, and favour went elsewhere. He returned to Portugal a veteran. By then, he had taken part in 3 expeditions to India, accumulated scars, learned the winds of the Indian Ocean, and built his own view of colonial politics. Yet the court saw little in him worth acknowledgement. His pay was reduced, new appointments were withheld, and when he requested advancement and the promised reward for his service at Malacca, the answer was a flat refusal. It was in this silence of recognition that a new feeling began to grow inside him. Injustice. A bitterness that whispered his efforts meant nothing to his homeland. By 1513, after years in Asia, Magellan returned seasoned and disciplined, a man others described as reliable, even exemplary. And yet at court he found no gratitude, no interest in his name. Portugal continued to expand overseas, but the king entrusted commands only to the great nobles, men with ancient titles and powerful allies. For Magellan, from a provincial family of dwindling means, it meant one thing: exclusion. The insult deepened further in 1514 when he was sent to Morocco. During a raid, he was wounded once again. Upon returning, he requested an increase in his pay to compensate for the injury. He was forced to petition repeatedly through various offices, humbling himself before clerks and secretaries, only to be denied again and again. And then came another humiliation. He became embroiled in a dispute involving the delivery of horses. Though an inquiry found no fault grave enough for punishment, the fact of investigation itself cast a shadow over his name. It was enough for the courtiers, already suspicious of outsiders, to turn colder still. Step by step, the distance between Magellan and his king widened. Step by step, his loyalty began to unravel. He thought Portugal would be his anchor. Instead, it was becoming the storm that drove him away. Magellan tried to defend his name. He submitted petitions, gathered testimonies of his service, pointed to his scars and his valour at Malacca. But his voice was faint against the chorus of powerful rivals. Each appeal ended the same way: silence or rejection. By 1517, after yet another refusal, he made a decision that few dared in his time. He would abandon Portugal. He would offer his sword, his knowledge, and his ambition to Spain, Lisbon's greatest enemy upon the seas. He did not leave in fire or fury. There was no dramatic speech, no defiant gesture. Quietly, almost invisibly, he departed the capital where he had become a shadow. He journeyed to Seville in Andalusia, a city alive with sails, merchants, and voices speaking of new worlds. Here, in a land foreign yet full of promise, a new phase of his life began. Spain was not yet the naval colossus Portugal had become, but it was growing fast, restless, eager to challenge the monopoly of Lisbon over the eastern routes. Whispers in Seville's taverns and council halls spoke of breaking Portugal's grip, of seizing the trade of spices that gilded the world. For Magellan, those whispers became a call. He was not alone. Another exile stood beside him, Rui Faleiro, a Portuguese scholar and astronomer of difficult temper but exceptional brilliance in navigation and cosmography. Together, the two men began to weave a project, bold, dangerous, but rooted in calculation. The idea was simple in outline, yet revolutionary in scope. By the Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain had no right to sail east toward India. Those seas belonged to Portugal. But if one could reach the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, from the west, by passing around the New World, then Spain could claim them as its own. It would not break the treaty, but bend it, proving that fortune and faith favoured Castile. It was a gamble, but not a fantasy. For success, they needed more than ships. They required legal foundation, astronomical precision, and above all the favour of the crown. Their first step was to approach Juan de Aranda, an influential official of the Casa de Contratación, the Castilian institution that organised overseas expeditions. Aranda listened carefully. He saw in their plan not folly, but opportunity, an opening to steal the initiative from Portugal. He agreed to help them carry their proposal to the young King of Spain, Charles III, and thus two exiles once ignored in Lisbon were now whispering into the ear of an empire. What had been rejected in Portugal was about to reshape the fate of Spain. In the opening months of 1518, Magellan set out for Valladolid, where the young King Charles I of Spain held court. The king was barely 18, his crown still heavy upon his brow, but already he showed an appetite for the vast chessboard of overseas power. When Magellan spoke before him, his words carried neither flattery nor desperation. They were calm, steady, and charged with conviction. He unfolded a map of seas yet uncharted, explained that he believed in the existence of a southern passage through the New World, pointed to rumours of a strait, and promised that he could lead a Spanish fleet to the Spice Islands without violating the treaty with Portugal. Charles listened, attentively. The proposal was bold, but the young monarch was surrounded by men who thought in terms of empires. His advisers, Castilians, Flemings, Genoese financiers, debated long into the evenings. At last, Charles gave his assent. In March of 1518, the capitulation of Valladolid was signed. By this document, Ferdinand Magellan was granted command of an expedition in the name of the Spanish crown. He received the title of Adelantado, the right to govern any new territories, the promise of a tenth of all profits, and full authority as Captain General. His companion, Rui Faleiro, was appointed chief adviser in matters of navigation. With a stroke of ink, a Portuguese exile became the leader of Spain's most ambitious maritime gamble. After the signing, Magellan took Castilian citizenship and reshaped his name into its Spanish form, Fernando de Magallanes. He settled in Seville, where his next trial began, not upon the ocean, but in the shipyards and counting houses. He had no ships, no men, and no treasury. All this had to be gathered, negotiated, and secured. Behind him, Portugal was gone forever, a homeland that had cast him aside. Before him, Spain, suspicious, watchful, but willing to wager its future upon his resolve. From Valladolid he returned to Seville, carrying authority few foreigners had ever possessed in Spain. He now acted in the name of King Charles, with a mandate to equip a fleet bound westward to the Moluccas, skirting Portuguese waters. The task was immense. He had to assemble ships, procure supplies, recruit crews, secure astronomical charts, and arrange financing. Above all, he had to maintain control of the project, for many Spanish officials and captains viewed him with mistrust. Seville at this time was the beating heart of Castile's transatlantic trade. Along the wharves of Triana, hammer blows rang out against timbers, sails flapped in the wind, and the air was heavy with tar and salt. Day and night ships departed for the Americas, returning laden with cacao, hides, gold, and letters describing new lands. Those who commanded these flows of wealth respected only three things: discipline, punctuality, and the authority of a captain who could be obeyed. It was here, among the warehouses and slipways of the Guadalquivir, that Magellan began to forge his fleet, and it was here that the doubts of others would collide with the steel of his determination. At last, the Crown placed 5 ships at the disposal of the expedition. They were uneven, different in size, strength, and seaworthiness, yet together they formed the fragile bones of a fleet meant to challenge the oceans. The flagship was Trinidad, sturdy, well-armed, and chosen as Magellan's own vessel. San Antonio was the largest by tonnage, capable of carrying supplies and heavy equipment. Concepcion, lighter and more agile, suited for manoeuvres. Victoria, a modest but resilient carrack, whose fate would later become legendary. And Santiago, the smallest of the flotilla, designed for scouting coastlines and shallow bays. They were not in pristine condition. Some required new rigging, others hull repairs. Fresh sails had to be woven, barrels were procured, hundreds of them, for storing water, vinegar, salted meat. Provisions filled warehouses, dried fish, hardtack, oil, rice, wine. Alongside food, goods for barter were gathered. Beads, knives, axes, copper bells, and bright cloth, tokens with which to win the favour of unknown peoples. The work was endless, and every detail mattered. Supplies had to be tallied, checked, and packed into the holds according to a meticulous order. If the ships themselves were a challenge, the crew was a greater one still. Castilian sailors bristled at the idea of serving under a foreign commander. Recruitment dragged on, drawing men from Andalusia, from the rocky coasts of Galicia, from Basque harbours, from Flanders and Italy. A few Portuguese, exiles like Magellan, offered their loyalty. Some came willingly, others came as convicts, pardoned on the condition of service. In the end, around 240 souls were bound together by oath and necessity, though not by trust. Tensions smouldered before the fleet had even touched the sea. Among the captains chosen by the Council of the Indies, none looked upon Magellan with loyalty. Juan de Cartagena, commander of San Antonio, was more than a captain. He was the Crown's inspector, and his disdain for Magellan was evident from the first day. Gaspar de Quesada and Luis de Mendoza, commanding other vessels, shared the same belief, that true authority should rest with Castilians, not with a Portuguese outsider. Their opposition was quiet, but it was constant, like the grinding of a hidden reef beneath the keel. Even Magellan's own ally was lost. Rui Falero, originally named co-commander of the expedition, succumbed to fits of rage and despair, his mind consumed by storms no chart could predict. Magellan saw what others would not admit. To bring such a man across oceans would be to court disaster. With sorrow, but with clarity, he removed Falero from command. It left him alone at the top, no partner to share the burden, no shield against suspicion, but also no rival to his authority. The fleet now had one commander, and he bore its weight like a man already walking into history. Magellan himself oversaw every detail, the inspections, the bargaining, the selection of officers. He appointed skilled pilots, among them Antonio Pigafetta, a Venetian whose curiosity and diligence would one day immortalize the voyage as its chief chronicler. Among the sailors stood a Basque mariner named Juan Sebastian Elcano. Once the captain of a merchant vessel, debts had driven him into disgrace. Now he sought redemption. At this point his role was modest, his name absent from the staff rolls, but Magellan knew of his skill and quietly kept him in mind as a reserve. The Casa de la Contratación supplied the instruments of discovery: astrolabes, compasses, quadrants, hourglasses, and charts. Some were common maps, others secret documents reserved for command alone. With seas unknown ahead, precision was everything. A miscalculation could doom not just ships, but souls. By August 1519, preparations ended. The flotilla slipped from Seville, drifting down the slow green waters of the Guadalquivir. Crews slept on deck as ships waited on the tides. At Sanlúcar de Barrameda, near the mouth of the river, they lingered nearly a month. Final inspections, final provisions, waiting for the winds to turn in their favour. Here Magellan gathered his captains for one last council. His voice held no bluster, no threats, only a steady firmness. He spoke of duty, of the trust of the crown, of the value of each sailor's life. But he also spoke of discipline, without which their path would collapse into chaos. The room was quiet when he finished. Some officers nodded with politeness, others said nothing, their silence heavier than words. The resistance had not gone, it had only sunk deeper, like embers waiting for air. And still, the ships were ready. On the morning of September the 20th, 1519, under the toll of church bells and the murmur of prayers, the 5 vessels pulled one by one from the quay. Crowds lined the shore to watch them depart. On their masts, the banners of Castile snapped in the wind. In their holds lay sacks of flour, coils of rope, Barrels of water and wine, crates of weapons. On their deck stood men whose names history had not yet learned, and only one among them knew where, in truth, he aimed to go. As the fleet of Ferdinand Magellan left Sanlúcar de Barrameda and entered the Atlantic, none of the men knew what awaited. They could not imagine the voyage would last almost 3 years, nor that it would circle the globe. For the moment the winds were fair, supplies were ample, the 5 ships sailed in close formation, spirits were steady and bellies still full, the sea seemed generous, the journey calm. But calm seas are the silence before revelation. The ships turned south, tracing the coast of Africa before striking west across the Atlantic. By November, the fleet sighted the shores of South America. A month later, they entered a sweeping bay at the mouth of a river that future maps would name Rio de Janeiro. There, Magellan allowed his men a pause. Anchors dropped, sails furled, the weary crews were granted rest. Repairs were made, ropes tightened, sails patched. Fresh water flowed into barrels. Knives, mirrors, and scraps of cloth were traded with the locals for fish, fruit, meat, and timber. For a brief moment, the air of the harbour seemed peaceful, almost idyllic for an expedition born of rivalry and suspicion. But the respite could not last. Sailing further south, they probed the mouth of the Rio de la Plata in January 1520, searching for a passage to the west. The geography seemed promising: a wide estuary, brackish waters, a powerful current. Hopes rose that this might be the long-sought strait, yet within days those hopes dissolved. It was not a doorway, but another dead end. Disappointment lingered in the air, but Magellan pressed onward, guiding his men into harsher latitudes where the winds turned sharp, the seas restless, and the coasts forbidding. By March, autumn in the southern hemisphere, the fleet reached a deep sheltered bay, later named San Julian. Magellan made a sober decision. They would winter there. To push farther in storm season would mean disaster. It was the wise choice, but wisdom does not always win loyalty. Cold crept into the bones of the men. Weeks of idleness gnawed at discipline. Fresh food grew scarce. Spirits withered, and with them patience. What had once been grumbling now coalesced into conspiracy. The ringleaders emerged. Juan de Cartagena of San Antonio, Gaspar de Quesada, captain of Concepcion, and Luis de Mendoza, commander of Victoria. Cartagena, who had long sneered that a Portuguese could not rule Spanish ships, now found his moment. Using the isolation of the bay, the conspirators acted. One night they raised the banner of defiance. Cartagena and Quesada refused to follow Magellan's orders. On Victoria, Mendoza seized command outright. Casting aside officers still loyal to the Captain General, Magellan, left with only Trinidad and Santiago, faced a rebellion that could tear the fleet apart before the ocean had even tested them. But he did not hesitate. Rather than wait, he struck. Swiftly, decisively, he seized Victoria back under his control. The night of quiet mutiny was about to ignite into reckoning. In the darkness between April 1st and 2nd, Magellan struck. Loyal officers, Juan Serrano and Gomez de Espinosa, led armed men across the water and stormed Victoria. The mutineers were caught unprepared. Mendoza, refusing to yield, was cut down on deck. Control of the ship swung back to Magellan. It was the turning point. With Victoria in his grasp, the balance shifted. The next day he pressed the advantage. Through sudden attack and the looming threat of artillery, the remaining ships were brought back under command. Cartagena and Quesada were seized. A field court-martial was convened, the charges laid bare before the assembled crew. Gaspar de Quesada was found guilty of armed insurrection. On the shore near the camp, in full view of the men, he was executed, beheaded as a warning. Cartagena, though equally guilty, bore connections to the Council of the Indies. Magellan spared him execution, but ordered him cast ashore in a barren place with a priest who had sided with him. Abandoned without hope of return, they vanished into the silence of the land. The rebellion was crushed, but the fleet was scarred. Magellan moved swiftly to bind the wounds with discipline. He restructured command, abolished old agreements, and imposed a strict hierarchy. One by one, the men swore loyalty to him as supreme commander. It was a dangerous gamble, but a necessary one. Without unity, there could be no survival. Yet survival was never guaranteed. Soon after, Santiago was sent to scout the southern coast. A storm rose, and the ship was dashed against the rocks. Miraculously, the crew survived. Exhausted, they walked miles across hostile terrain until they stumbled back into camp. Their return was relief, but the loss of the vessel was a stark warning. In these latitudes, every mistake was fatal. Still, Magellan pressed onward. He did not know where the strait lay, nor if it existed at all, but he knew waiting meant death of another kind. With the arrival of spring, ice receded, storms eased, and he gave the order to prepare. In late October, the fleet, reduced now to 4 ships, pulled anchor and turned south again. San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and the flagship Trinidad crawled along the jagged, merciless coast. The cliffs rose black and endless. The winds slashed. The air stung with snow and damp. Over a year had passed since they had left Spain. Supplies ran low. Patience grew thinner than sails against the wind. The promise of a passage, this phantom of the Western Sea, remained unfound. And among the officers, tension swelled like a storm unspoken. They wondered if they were chasing a mirage. On October 21st, the fleet sighted a headland where the coast folded into a narrow mouth of water. From high atop the mast, a lookout called down. The inlet bent inland deeper than a simple bay. Magellan's heart quickened. After a short council, he gave the order, "Enter." He believed this might be it, the passage he had sought for so long. The link between the Atlantic and the unknown waters whispered of in rumour, feared in silence, dreamed of in sleepless nights. What first appeared as a harbour unfolded into a labyrinth, a twisting, jagged channel hemmed by lifeless cliffs. Sheer slopes rose above, stone walls casting long shadows over the grey waters. Winds shrieked from the ridges, tearing at the sails, driving the ships toward danger. And yet the fleet advanced. The strait narrowed, then widened again. It forked into side channels, bays and islands. Constantly they were forced to halt, lower boats, measure depths, and search for safe water. At times the vessels split apart, some remaining in the main channel, others probing side passages. Amid this confusion came one of the darkest blows to the expedition, the desertion of San Antonio. The ship was formerly under Juan de Cartagena, but in truth guided by pilot Esteban Gomez, a skilled sailor, but one who had long opposed Magellan. Seizing the moment when the other ships were hidden by bends of the strait, Gomes gave his order. San Antonio turned. It abandoned the strait, slipped out into the open ocean, and set course for Spain. On board were charts, records, documents, everything that could reveal Magellan's plan. This was no mere escape. It was betrayal. A betrayal that could unravel not only the voyage, but the fragile support of the Spanish crown. Days later, Magellan realized the truth. The rendezvous passed with no sign of San Antonio. He did not pursue. He could not. With fewer ships, the risks were already staggering. To divide further would be ruin. And so the remaining vessels pressed onward through the treacherous waters. The passage consumed nearly 38 days. Crews strained at the rigging, wrestled sails against crosswinds, scrambled up cliffs to scout the way, drafted rough maps as they went. The strait was capricious, sometimes barely 2 kilometres across, sometimes 5. Depths shifted without warning. Currents pulled strong and erratic. There were days when waters rose violently, forcing them to shelter in coves. Other days, the fog pressed so thick that direction itself dissolved. Only the steady hands of seasoned pilots kept them from dashing upon the reefs. But hardship left its mark. Men weakened. Fever spread from damp and cold. Fingers and faces grew raw with frostbite. Arguments broke out below deck, shrill voices above it. Tired bodies sagged against ropes, and some broke into raving fits, unable to bear the unending grey. Still, they moved forward, clinging to hope as fragile as their hulls. For beyond the cliffs, the ocean waited. Contrary to tales that painted him as cold and distant, Magellan was everywhere. He walked the decks, climbed into councils, gave his pilots precise orders, and spoke to his weary officers with quiet resolve. He knew the truth. If the men broke now, halfway through the strait, everything would collapse into ruin. And then, at last, the horizon changed. On November 28th, they cleared the final rocky edge. Before them stretched not cliffs and storms, but an open expanse of water, flat, calm, endless. The sailors, who for weeks had battled squalls, frozen ropes and punishing winds, now felt a steady breeze, and the soft roll of waves beneath their feet. The sea itself seemed to exhale. It was another ocean. Magellan stood on the stern of Trinidad, silent for a long time. He watched the vast blue, saying nothing, as though afraid to disturb its stillness. At last he spoke. Mar Pacifico, the Pacific Sea. He did not name it for what it was, but for what it meant. After mutiny, after shipwreck, after betrayal, the very idea of peace was a miracle. The victory was real. The strait had been found, charted, crossed. For the first time in history, men had passed through from one ocean to another. The impossible was now behind them. Before them lay the Pacific. But the ocean was no gift. When the 3 remaining ships sailed westward from the passage Magellan had revealed, a new trial began. Not a battle against men, not even a war against storms. This was slower, crueler, a test of silence, time, and hunger. At first it seemed a blessing. The waters were unnaturally calm. No hurricanes, no raging squalls, no towering waves. The winds were steady, the course held true. Compared to the fury of the Atlantic and the Strait, this quiet felt divine. For the first week, all went well. They held to their westward heading, convinced they would reach the Spice Islands within a month. But day by day, the truth revealed itself. No birds in the sky, no clouds on the horizon, no scent of land upon the air, only the blazing sun, the swelling heat, and the endless horizon that mocked their hope. Fresh water turned foul. Food dwindled faster than their calculations allowed. The salted meat rotted in the barrels. Bread was gone. The flour was black with mould. The men chewed what remained. Dry fish, scraps of rice. Hard lumps of cheese turned sharp with age. Then worse. Pigafetta would later record the desperation. Sawdust boiled for soup, softened leather straps chewed for hours, even rotting sailcloth swallowed to quiet the emptiness within. This was not a storm of waves, but of hunger. A famine carried on still water, and no horizon brought relief. Soon the ocean unveiled another enemy. Not tempests, not reefs, but a disease born of deprivation. Scurvy crept silently through the crews. At first it showed in bleeding gums, then in teeth that fell loose from jaws, in swollen limbs, in bodies drained of strength. Fingers went numb, knees buckled beneath the smallest burden, and men collapsed at their posts. Every day, 2 or 3 shapes wrapped in sailcloth slid into the sea. The ocean became their grave, its silence broken only by the splash of bodies sinking below. On many ships, the sailors could no longer manage their duties. Officers took the night watches themselves. Carpenters replaced helmsmen. Pilots prepared what passed for meals. The work went on in grim silence. No storms to roar, no thunder to crack, no voices from shore, only the creak of masts, the rare cry of a bird and the laboured breath of the dying. Pigafetta, who chronicled their torment, later wrote that in all those weeks they sighted no island large enough to bring relief. Once, a dark line rose on the horizon, but it proved barren, surrounded by fangs of coral that denied landing. The fleet sailed on, still starving. Weeks blurred, 1 month passed, then another. Time itself dissolved. Men forgot the count of days. Even officers lost the thread of weeks. The pilots tried to track their course, but their reckoning faltered. With no reliable instruments, their dead reckoning was based only on the speed of the ship, the tilt of the wind, the sun's passage across the sky. A single mile's error each day multiplied into hundreds. By the 3rd month, no one knew how far they had travelled, nor how far remained. Through it all, Magellan endured. He masked his own exhaustion, walking the decks, speaking with the pilots, gathering his officers for brief councils. To the men, he showed no doubt. Pigafetta, however, would later recall shadows of fatigue in the Captain General's eyes. Magellan did not rely on fear. Instead, he steadied the crew by his presence. He fell silent when silence was needed, spoke only to encourage or to command, and then deliverance. In early March 1521, 3 months and 1 day after leaving the strait, a cry shattered the stillness. A sailor on Concepcion shouted from aloft, "Land!" At first, no one dared believe him, but an hour later the truth stood clear, the outline of green rising from the horizon, not barren, not hostile, alive. It was Guam, one of the Mariana Islands, shores fringed with palms, fresh streams spilling into the sea. As they approached, men stared in disbelief, tears mixing with salt on their cheeks. They landed at once. Sailors flung themselves to the water, drinking until they collapsed on the sand. Coconuts were hacked from trees, roots dug up, fruits gathered in frantic relief. In a single day, the crews regained more strength than in weeks adrift. The ocean had tested them with silence. The land gave them back their voices. Not all survived the gift of abundance. A few men, their bodies too fragile after months of starvation, died on the beach, undone by the sudden flood of food and water. But for the rest, Guam was salvation. Strength returned to their limbs, and breath returned to their lungs. The island was inhabited. The first meeting with the locals was uneasy. The stolen boat sparked anger, but no violence followed. What mattered most was water, fruit, and rest. These, at last, were given. Behind them lay the greatest crossing in the history of seafaring. 3 months across the Pacific, without storms, without land, without sound but hunger and silence. From South America to Asia, they had endured the unendurable, yet the hardest chapters were still to come. After that brief stop at Guam, the 3 surviving ships sailed westward again, chasing the Spice Islands. In mid-March 1521, they reached Samar, one of the larger Philippine islands, and anchored near a quiet beach on nearby Homonhon. There, on March 16th, the crews established a temporary camp. Men staggered ashore to rest, gather food, and repair their rigging. It was here that first contact came. From the horizon, bamboo canoes appeared, paddled by islanders holding spears, but without hostility. They drew near cautiously, their dark eyes searching the strangers, their movements alert but not aggressive. Magellan turned to his interpreter, Enrique of Malacca. Once a slave, now a crucial voice, Enrique spoke in a tongue the islanders understood, or at least close enough to bridge the silence. Through him, the strangers learned of a ruler nearby, Raja Kalambu of Limasawa, a man respected, inclined to trade, willing to talk. Magellan moved swiftly. He arranged a meeting. Raja Kalambu greeted them warmly. In exchange for cloth, metal goods, and trinkets, he offered food, water, and guides. What began as wary gestures turned into a pact of friendship. On March 31, 1521, on the island of Limasawa, the first Mass was celebrated on Philippine soil. Under open sky, by the shore, priests lifted the host, while European sailors and local chiefs stood together listening. For Magellan, it was more than ceremony. It was a symbol. His expedition had not only crossed the ocean, it had entered a new world, not by the sword, but by the word. From Limasawa, the fleet turned towards Cebu, a thriving hub of trade and politics, where new alliances and new dangers awaited. The sea had carried them here. Now men, not storms, would decide their fate. In Cebu, they found a ruler of stature, Raja Humabon, a man of pragmatism and ambition. Magellan understood that the success of his expedition and Spain's foothold in these islands depended not only on discovery but on alliances. He staged a grand display. Cannons thundered, muskets cracked, steel blades glinted. Gifts of weapons, cloth, mirrors and ornaments were laid before the Raja. Humabon, impressed by the power of European arms and eager to strengthen his standing among rival chiefs, accepted not only alliance but baptism. On April 14th, 1521, the Raja was baptized under the name Carlos, his wife under the name Juana, in honour of Spain's royal pair. In their footsteps, nearly 800 islanders followed. A wooden cross was raised, a mass celebrated beneath the sky, and a feast held. Magellan believed the pact was now sealed in faith as well as politics. To him, Cebu was secured, its people bound to Spain not only by agreement but by the cross. Yet faith can fracture as swiftly as it unites. Among the neighbouring chiefs was one who refused both submission and baptism, Lapu-Lapu of Mactan. He rejected Humabon's authority, rejected Magellan's God, rejected Spain itself. To him, Cebu's alliance was weakness, not strength. His defiance was clear. Humabon, troubled, turned to Magellan. He asked the Captain-General to punish this rival who mocked both their names. Magellan agreed. He wished to prove his power, to demonstrate that the new faith carried not only prayer, but steel. Confident that a show of arms would suffice, he did not mobilize the full fleet. Instead, he chose a strike force, 50 armed Spaniards, and a handful of Cebuano allies. He believed their presence alone would break resistance, but the land itself conspired against him. At dawn on April 27, the Spanish force approached the shores of Mactan. The ships could not come close. The reef and shallows barred the artillery. Forced into the water, soldiers waded ashore in heavy armour beneath the burning sun. There, hundreds of Lapu-Lapu's warriors waited, prepared and unafraid. Spears gleamed, shields locked, voices rose in chants of defiance. Magellan kept his composure. He ordered restraint, hoping still that discipline and muskets would terrify the defenders. He expected them to scatter at the first shots, but the attack faltered. The Cebuano allies fled. The Spaniards, mired in waist-deep shallows, stumbled under the weight of their armour. Their formation broke, and then Lapu-Lapu struck. With numbers, with speed, with the mastery of his own ground, he encircled the intruders. The moment of revelation had come, not of oceans, but of mortality. The battle at Mactan turned into chaos. Steel clashed against wood, and cries echoed over the shallows. Magellan, refusing to retreat, covered his men's withdrawal. He fought with sword in hand until a spear struck his leg. Staggering, he lost his footing and fell into the water. There, surrounded, he became a target. Witnesses would later say he never begged for mercy. But the tide of warriors pressed in. Spears and blades pierced his body one after another until he no longer rose. The Spaniards tried to reach him, but the defenders drove them back toward the boats. They were forced into retreat, leaving their captain's body behind. Days later, Raja Humabon offered ransom for his remains, but Lapu-Lapu refused. The body of Ferdinand Magellan never returned. So ended the life of the man who had walked from Portugal to the far side of the world, who had unveiled a strait, crossed the Pacific, and forged the first alliances between Europe and the East. He died not in storm, not in sickness, but on foreign soil, in armour, cut down by those who saw him not as a messenger of faith, but as a conqueror. Yet his voyage did not die with him. The fleet remained. Men still breathed who longed for home, and the circle of the world was still incomplete. But grief quickly deepened into dread. Without Magellan, the expedition lost not only its captain, but its anchor, its authority, its discipline, its sense of meaning. For days, officers tried to maintain their pact with Humabon, clinging to the alliance with Cebu, but trust had already withered. On May 1st, 1521, at a feast arranged by their hosts, the trap was sprung. At the signal, blades rose. About 27 Spaniards were cut down, among them the captains of Trinidad and Concepcion. Those aboard the ships hauled anchor in haste and escaped, but the damage was done. They were weakened, leaderless, and bleeding. The decision was merciless but necessary. Concepcion, undermanned and battered, was burned. On May 2nd, fire consumed her empty decks, and the fleet was reduced to 2. Command passed then to Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Basque pilot, not noble, not chosen by birthright but by trust. He was steady, quiet, calm in crisis. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, he offered a course, not to turn back across the Pacific, but to finish what they had begun. Reach the Moluccas, load the ships with spices, and return to Spain by the Western Sea, around Africa. In November, after storms and loss, 2 battered ships finally arrived at Ternate, one of the key spice islands. There, Sultan Almansa, at odds with the Portuguese, welcomed them as allies. A treaty was struck. The Spaniards at last filled their holds, not with promises, but with sacks of cloves, the most precious cargo of the East. For a month they stayed, repairing, healing, restoring strength. But when it came time to depart, another choice waited, a choice that would decide who among them would see home again. From Ternate, the final decision was made. Victoria would sail west through the Indian Ocean, while Trinidad, battered and weary, would attempt the return eastward across the Pacific. It was a fateful choice. Trinidad, crippled by storms, lost her masts and began to sink. In May 1522 she fell into Portuguese hands. Her crew was scattered into prisons, some to Malacca, some to Goa. Years would pass before a handful ever saw Europe again. That left one ship. Victoria became the last hope of the circumnavigation. In December, she raised her patched sails and slipped into the Indian Ocean, carrying just 47 Europeans and 13 Asian sailors. At her helm stood Juan Sebastian Elcano, guiding the vessel through seas haunted by Portuguese patrols. The voyage was relentless. The wind shifted without mercy, now dead calm, now violent storm. Food rotted quickly, water ran low, and scurvy struck again. Flesh withered, gums bled, lives ebbed away. Yet Elcano pressed onward, choosing the emptiness of open ocean over the risk of capture in coastal ports. They avoided Muscat, avoided Mozambique, avoided every safe harbour. Only once did they dare land, in Cape Verde, on Portuguese soil. There, under false pretences, they claimed to be merchants wrecked by storm. For a brief moment they tasted bread and fresh water, but the deception was uncovered. Some of the crew were seized. Elcano did not wait. He gave the order. Sails unfurled and Victoria slipped away, leaving her captured companions behind. Every hour mattered now. The ship groaned with every gust, seams yawning, sails stitched 100 times. Delay was death. And then, at last, the horizon of home appeared. On September the 6th, 1522, at the height of the Andalusian summer, Victoria crept into the harbour of Seville. She was a ghost of a ship, her sails frayed, her hull cracked, her timbers weary from 3 years of salt and wind. From the 5 vessels that had left, 1 returned. Of the 270 who had sailed, only 18 Europeans and 4 Asians stepped ashore. No trumpets greeted them, no cheering crowds, only silence and disbelief. Many had long thought them lost, swallowed by seas without end. Yet the ship carried more than men. In her hold were 26 tons of cloves, wealth enough to cover the cost of the entire expedition. But the true treasure lay elsewhere, in journals and maps, in astronomical notes and sketches of unknown lands, in knowledge once imagined but now proven. The world was round, it could be circled. The survivors stood on Spanish soil, changed beyond recognition. Their bodies wasted, their faces scarred, their movements slow, like men carved by the sea itself. They carried no triumph in their eyes, only the quiet of those who had lived too long with silence, hunger, and storms. And yet, in their silence, the impossible had been made real. The circle of the earth was complete. When Victoria limped into Seville, no trumpets played, no parades marched. What greeted the survivors was not glory, but scrutiny. Officials from the Casa de Contratación and representatives of the Crown stepped aboard, counting sacks of cloves, inspecting the weathered men, listening with suspicion to their impossible tale. At first the sailors were placed under watch, their words carefully recorded. They were questioned for hours, their route charted step by step. The accounts went first to trade authorities, later to the court of Emperor Charles V himself. One Sebastian Elcano was summoned to Valladolid. There, in the emperor's presence, he received a coat of arms unlike any before, the image of a globe, encircled with the Latin words, Primus circumdedisti me. You were the first to circle me. Along with this emblem came a royal pension, recognition of what he and his men had achieved. Yet triumph did not grant long life. Elcano's health, broken by the voyage, soon failed. A few years later he died at sea, again in the southern Pacific, never reaching old age. The others fared no better. Of the 18 Europeans who had stepped onto Spanish soil, many soon succumbed to sickness, malnutrition, or exhaustion that had hollowed them from within. Only a few endured. Some, like Francesco Albo, returned to the sea. Others disappeared into obscurity. One among them, however, gave the world more than silence. Antonio Pigafetta, the Venetian who had sailed not as a soldier but as a chronicler, became their voice. He had written notes throughout the expedition, but upon return he shaped them into a coherent, almost diary-like account. His manuscript, first in Italian, later translated into French, became one of the great historical records of the Age of Discovery. Through his words, Europe glimpsed for the first time a systematic description of the peoples of the Philippines, the Moluccas, and Oceania. He captured not only battles and storms, but rituals, languages, foods, beliefs, the textures of a world that had been rumour now made real. The consequences of the voyage could not be measured in a single season, but in decades they became undeniable. The globe, once stitched with conjecture, became measurable. Oceans ceased to be the edge of the world and became corridors of passage. The expedition had shown the unthinkable. The east could be reached by sailing west. For Spain, it was more than discovery. It was a symbolic triumph over Portugal, an economic precedent, and above all a strategic advantage. Ships had been lost, men had perished, yet a single hull, heavy with cloves, returned wealth enough to balance the books. And greater still than wealth was the prize of perspective, the knowledge that the earth was round, vast, and open. The map of the human spirit had widened. The voyage was not an ending, but a threshold. The opening of the route to the riches of the East, treacherous, deadly, yet possible, reshaped the balance of the seas. Portugal, stung by the success of Spain's circumnavigation, struck back swiftly. In the following year they seized Trinidad, captured her crew, and scattered them across their colonial prisons. They tightened their patrols along Africa's eastern coast, and they sought the Pope's decree to confirm their rights over the Moluccas. The rivalry between the two crowns burned on, until the Treaty of Zaragoza drew a temporary line across the oceans of the world. But beyond treaties and conflicts, something greater had shifted. What once existed only as theory had been carved into reality. The earth was no longer a puzzle of fragments, guessed at from hearsay and legend. It was whole, connected, a globe that could be crossed, measured, endured. The oceans were no longer edges, they were corridors. The voyage became a path for others, merchants, explorers, scientists, and mapmakers. They would follow, expand, revise. But the first line had been drawn across the face of the planet, and at the centre of that line stood a man who did not live to see its completion. Ferdinand Magellan never returned. His bones lay in foreign soil, yet his name became more enduring than any monument. His quarrel with Portugal, his defiance before kings, his unbending will, his faith and his cruelty, all merged into a figure larger than his life. His name was given to a strait in South America, to two glowing clouds of stars in the southern sky, and above all to an idea that the earth is one and that it can be crossed entire. The expedition did not merely chart a course, it marked a divide in human history. Before it, the world was fractured, imagined in fragments. After it, the world became whole, measurable, traversable, bound by seas instead of broken by them. It was not the end of discovery, it was the point of no return. And from that point, humanity would never look at the horizon the same way again.